Welcome to the Retail Focus Podcast, a weekly collection of news, interviews, and information from the world of retail. Here are your hosts, Trent Kling and Leighton Kling.
Welcome to this edition of the Retail Focus Podcast. I'm Trent Kling. He's Leighton Kling, feeling a bit under the weather today, but today's show, we've got a deep dive into Dollar Tree and Family Dollar. They released earnings, but more importantly, we're going to do our semi-yearly catch-up on some of their initiatives. We've also got Costco to discuss and Kroger, which is what we'll finish out the show with. Our interview guest today, Dani Cushion, the always amazing Dani Cushion, the CMO at Cardlytics. She joins us to discuss some numbers that they've got regarding customers that come back in the first quarter and just how important those customers are to the rest of the year. A reminder, you can like us, rate us, however you do access us, whether that's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any other podcast listening service. You can also check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Retail Podcast. And, you know, Dani Cushion's going to talk about how important those first quarter customers are. There are a lot of retailers out there seeing these customers come in because of coronavirus, or really, if you wanted to be specific about the strain of the coronavirus, it's COVID-19, but we're seeing a lot of activity surrounding that. There's a lot of speculation as far as retail is concerned, and we wanted to kind of start the show off just by talking about how coronavirus is impacting our retail locally. Now, where I live, Colorado, as of time of this recording, there's only 8 reported cases, so it's not that big of a deal in terms of the actual impact. However, in talking to retailers here, and we actually posted a picture on our Instagram of a Walmart in Colorado. It was in a more rural area in Colorado than where I live. They were actually out of hand sanitizer and a lot of sanitizing wipes as of Saturday of last week. That has continued. I actually spoke with the local Kroger affiliate, a store manager for one of their stores here where I live, and they said their sales were actually up significantly. You're looking at customers buying not only hand sanitizer, sanitizing wipes, but they are also seeing people buy literal cases of Clorox and bleach, as well as stock up on a lot of goods, including milk and bread. They said really the last 3 weeks they've been seeing it. 3 weeks ago, it was because of a snowstorm that was supposed to happen that never did. The last 2 weeks, they're seeing a lot of people stock up on milk and bread, and from their perspective, I don't want to put words in the store manager's mouth or Kroger's mouth, but nothing could be a better case circumstance than someone buying a lot of something perishable that will spoil and then having to go back out for it if this coronavirus thing does not spread. So we're looking at a potential positive impact across the board, and the retailers we talked about today will all discuss coronavirus in their earnings calls. Leighton, what are you seeing out there in California? Because I know the situation is a little bit more, I don't want to say dire, but there's a few more cases confirmed out there.
Yeah, that's right. And aside from me being sick this week, Trent, hopefully it's not COVID-19, but I think a lot of people are worried in terms of outdoor shopping centers and indoor shopping centers. So in terms of your conventional malls, I have talked to some mall managers and they've said that overall traffic has declined in the past 2 or 3 weeks. So people are not going out with their families. People are not going to movie theaters as much. Obviously, that's not retail centric, but movie theaters do attach to conventional shopping centers. So that will affect the overall traffic trends that we've been seeing. But as far as supermarkets, your Costco's of the world, the Sam's Clubs of the world, I think traffic's not only either stayed the same, but it's gone up in certain areas. And certainly the Costco near where I live, which is Tustin, California, is always busy. And I think I mentioned this once before on the podcast, but that particular Costco actually does over $300 million per year in sales. So if there was a sales spike, I wouldn't be able to tell because it's always jam-packed full of members. And so as far as your local grocery stores are concerned, you have Ralph's out here. You have a number of Albertsons around here and the other banners that go along with that, such as Vaughn's or Pavilions. They mentioned to me, the store managers or assistant store managers mentioned to me that they have seen a spike in a lot of things in the HBA, so health and beauty, being a lot of those products being sold a little bit more. And I actually picked up, again, because I am sick, some cold medicine and some vitamin C packs, and both of those aisles in which they were on were pretty sparse. So people were definitely opening their pocketbooks for those kinds of items, either for symptom relief or to try to get ahead of something if it does hit. But as far as overall concern and people not really wanting to get out, and aside from the traffic trends I mentioned with those conventional malls and maybe some outdoor malls, you see a lot of people still exercising their right to shop around, and whether that's for goods or services. One thing I will note is last night, Trent, I tried to go downtown LA for their comedy scene. They have a number of prominent comedy places and they were all sold out. So people are certainly not scared yet in terms of being able to go out to see a show with a crowd, maybe 200, 300, 400 people, and in very close quarters, by the way. So people are still active. People are still getting services, getting goods. But overall, I am curious because we talk about earnings calls all the time, Trent. In the next 3, 4, 5 months, we're going to really get a sense for what retailers have really won out versus those who maybe it's just steady as she goes. Because if you think of the likes of Walgreens and CVS and Costco, you would certainly think that not only just looking at the headlines, but anecdotally, that they are certainly going to see really, really good sales increases over the last several months.
And I think it's not just the overall obvious suspects like supermarkets, like those retail drugstores that you were mentioning, Leighton, but I went into a Home Depot yesterday. It was interesting because the Home Depot hadn't actually started or opened their garden center yet, which is a little bit later, even for Colorado this time of year. The Lowe's just down the street had definitely opened their garden center with a selection of trees and shrubs and the like. But this Home Depot had a section in the front of the store, and they didn't mention COVID-19 or coronavirus on there, but they had a variety of sanitizing products in this impulse buy section, including hand sanitizer. And actually, Home Depot was the only place I've been able to find hand sanitizer over the last few weeks, not because I'm necessarily in need of it. I always have a supply of hand sanitizer with me, but because it's just kind of curious to see which stores have it. Home Depot actually had hand sanitizer, but they had a number of other products like the Simple Green bleaching products, various Lysol sprays. And I sat in the Home Depot, or really just kind of like leaned against a shelf and watched for 5 minutes. And this particular display went from completely full to half full within that 5-minute period of time, because while people are in Home Depot, they're looking and saying, hey, I can't get this product anywhere else. I'm going to buy it. Now, that, of course, pales in comparison to a lot of the big ticket items that Home Depot expects this time of year because of how robust and busy the garden centers usually are this time of year. But I think it extends to other retailers too. L Brands would be one. Bath & Body Works, one of their most popular items is those little pocket-sized hand sanitizers. One of the Bath & Body Works near where I live completely sold out of those. So I think you might see some positive sales impacts certainly from this, especially when you consider that people really kind of buckling down on it. But in talking to some doctors and nurse practitioners this week, they said it was kind of funny because they said, we tell people to do this all the time, every single year because of the flu, and now people just pay attention because it is something that has garnered a lot of press attention, whether justly so or unjustly so. We'll leave that to everyone out there to decide, but you're looking at the use of hand sanitizer potentially going up. You wonder how much of an impact it's going to have going ahead if people continue this practice, if Bath & Body Works, other retailers continue to see a spike in hand sanitizers being sold. I think that's something to certainly keep an eye on going ahead. And from the retailers we heard from this week, it's certainly not a negative impact that we're seeing, particularly the first retailer we'll talk about today, which is Costco. Before we do that, Leighton, I had a very similar experience to yours. We went out Friday night to a local eatery. It's a pupuseria. It was absolutely jam-packed. We went from there to a tap room. It was absolutely jam-packed. There was no place to sit. So it doesn't seem like people, at least in Colorado, are all that scared of anything just yet. So let's talk about Costco. They released quarterly earnings this week amidst news, actually, that stores were running out of materials for these so-called doomsday preppers, if you want to call them that, or maybe just cautious people, either way. The earnings, which were for their second quarter of fiscal 2020, they also came along with the February sales update. And Leighton, let's talk about those February sales first.
Yeah, let's. And there's a lot of interesting things to get into, but they absolutely killed it on the comp front in February, with U.S. comp sales over the last 4 weeks increasing a whopping 11.6% when adjusting for, of course, gasoline sales. They were up 12.4% without that adjustment trend. So people are buying more of pretty much everything. And this is an absolutely massive amount for a general merchandise or warehouse retailer. And although we've come to expect mid to high single digits, this really speaks to the likely needless panic about coronavirus right now. And Costco echoed this, saying that sales were positive, but really saw an uptick in the 4th week of February, which is right around the time that the coronavirus worries spiked. And you saw a bunch of media headlines talking about people buying a ton of paper goods at their local Costco. And they went ahead and said that this week alone contributed a positive 3% impact to both total and comparable sales. Interestingly, they said that the highest performers in February were the Pacific Northwest, Texas, and the Midwest. While the Pacific Northwest actually does make sense, Trent, Seattle was one of the first cities in the United States, of course, to be affected by the coronavirus outbreak, or at least according to the news, it's what we heard. Strength in Texas and the Midwest suggests that either those are the most reactionary markets in terms of coronavirus fears, or they're just doing really well economically. We'll leave it to you to speculate. But across the month as a whole, lawn and garden stood out, but food and sundries saw the biggest bump. Since this does not include fresh foods, this makes absolute sense given the sales trends surrounding coronavirus. Still, their second quarter as a whole was excellent. It was reminiscent of the Costco earnings calls from 2 or 3 years ago, where comps were approaching double digits nearly every single quarter. And when adjusting for changes in gasoline prices, of course, you have to factor that in, U.S. comps were up 8.1% in the quarter as a whole. And it bears mention that this quarter ended February 16th of 2020. So any impacts from doomsday preppers were actually mitigated somewhat. So next quarter, we're going to be very curious to see those numbers that I mentioned earlier. But they did, however, see a 50 basis point benefit from Thanksgiving being a little bit later in 2019 than in 2018. Costco, of course, was in a position to potentially benefit from the shift because of the massive amount of Thanksgiving prepping that takes place during that time frame, where other retailers reportedly struggled during the period because of the truncated holiday shopping season. Traffic was up 6.1% in the U.S. during the quarter. The average ticket up nearly 3%. So they're having more shoppers, and those shoppers are spending more. And so you're looking at that 3% number, Trent. That actually does include the impacts from gas inflation. So the gasoline sales going up a bit there as well. E-commerce sales, by the way, saw an approximate 11% benefit from the shift. That benefit for e-commerce sales bumped them up to comp increases of around 28% for the firm as a whole. Once you parse out the impacts from foreign exchange, this was a big bump from the prior quarter, which suffered the impacts of the Thanksgiving shift that I just mentioned. So when you take out the first 2 quarters and you really look at the fiscal year in aggregate, e-commerce comps come out to around 17.3, and looking at this number mitigates somewhat the impact of the Thanksgiving shift. So still really good double-digit numbers there from the e-commerce front. Sales as a company were up 10.5%, mostly as a result from those comps, but also from the benefit of new stores. A few new stores in their system this year. No new openings in the second quarter, however. They also saw increased revenue from membership fee income, which was around $816 million, or 6.3% higher than last year. This is more or less in line with what they saw in the first quarter. And by the way, we talk about Sam's Club, we talk about Costco and their membership income. They do look at that, both internally and externally, as pure profit. So this is money that is pretty much going straight to the bottom line. Not necessarily perfect accounting methodology, but that is how they look at it. And that is what they tell their employees as well. So that's how they try to drive those new memberships. They are getting cardholders to move up tiers also in their membership system, and cardholders to pay into the organic price increases for their first tier, which is also going to help that bottom line. And this is going to be a big driver of segment revenue as a whole. They only saw about a 1% increase in overall cardholders, so people holding a Costco membership for the first time maybe out there, although the mark did peak above $100 million in the quarter. It's a lot of members at Costco. And a lot of people think about exclusivity. Anytime you assign a membership to something, you're going to automatically decrease the amount of customers that you're going to get. So therefore, traffic's going to be capped at a certain point. But 100 million members, paying members, is a lot to think about. And they added around 27,000 executive memberships per week in the quarter. And those are the memberships that are significantly higher than the base membership, around $60 to $70 more. Of course, they have incentives as well, but still, that is a lot of money coming in. And meanwhile, net income was also up, as you would expect, and their earnings per diluted share came in around $2.10 per share, where analysts expected around $2.07 per share, so a modest 3-cent beat on the earnings per share front. But this meant their overall company net margin came in at 2.43%, which, while fine for a general merchandise or warehouse club operator, was actually down from last year.
Now let's talk about some of the details that were covered on the call itself. They blamed the slight downturn in gross margin, as Leighton just discussed or alluded to, on a few different things, namely an increase in lower margin areas of their business, including grocery as one big example, and startup losses at their new poultry complex that Leighton discussed on the show last year. They opened that up in September of 2019. Now, as far as specific areas, they did mention a gross margin increase in soft lines with food and sundries. That doesn't include fresh food, by the way. Food and sundries remaining stagnant. Fresh foods and hard lines on the margin front did fall. It was this 1-2 punch, so decreasing margins in these areas, but increasing sales of fresh foods. That provided a bit of a hit on the gross margin front. Now, they do feel as though the poultry facility will begin to ramp up to full capacity this year and provide a benefit rather than a hindrance on the margin front. It was kind of interesting to hear their CFO on the call talk about how many birds they were moving in and out. It was almost like a Tyson earnings call there. But hardline sales as a whole was down in the quarter, although up in February. They attributed that to holiday timing, not because they suffered from a lack of moving product, but because their promotional activity, and they have a lot of it around Black Friday and the following week, that was all pushed into the second quarter this year, whereas it was in the first quarter of last year. So again, they moved just as much merchandise, just didn't bring in as much money on that. And like I said, hardline sales were back up in February. They did note that selling, general, and administrative expenses did improve slightly as a percentage of sales, down 22 basis points. One of the other things that they noted outside of just talking about margins and the numbers, it was that category strength in the quarter was difficult to pinpoint, in part because of that holiday shift. However, categories they called out as being successful for them in the quarter included seasonal, toys, which is interesting because we just talked a couple of weeks ago how toys seem to be down across the board. Makes sense, though, that toys were up versus a quarter that didn't include some of those holiday comps. And then housewares, those were all up year over year, and they saw a discrete benefit from that holiday shift. Food and sundries were up in low single digits comp-wise, as were those lower margin fresh foods. Meat and produce were the superstars there. Those categories were up in February alone as well. Now, Costco as a whole noted that online grocery continues to grow faster than other e-commerce sales. Their other e-commerce sales, they're in low double-digit range, but their grocery e-commerce sales are really growing, whether that be from 2-day delivery, some limited same-day delivery options there, or Instacart sales. And one of the things that I noted on the call was that it's kind of interesting how they categorize Instacart sales. They aren't included in Costco's e-commerce sales, so they're not included in those growth numbers that Leighton specified when they report earnings, because the Instacart shoppers receive the order and come into stores to shop for and purchase the products. Therefore, it's strictly a third-party process, and for Costco, from Costco's perspective, it's just a brick-and-mortar transaction. So they're just seeing those Instacart shoppers coming in and purchasing those products and leaving as though it's a brick-and-mortar transaction. Now, Instacart does still give those numbers to Costco, and they are seeing Instacart increases by double digits on a year-over-year basis. But what everyone came to the call to learn was how coronavirus is truly impacting sales and categories. Now, it was thought ahead of the call that it could be a little bit of give and take for Costco because of the business they do in China, because of some of the product they source from overseas, but because of those so-called preppers coming into Costco and purchasing product. And in prepared remarks, they listed shelf-stable dry grocery items, cleaning supplies, Clorox and other forms of bleach, water, paper goods, hand sanitizers, sanitizing wipes, disinfectants, that HBA, and this is what I found the most humorous, water filtration systems as going up there. So apparently they think that coronavirus might bring about some sort of fallout for the utility system in the United States, but still, those are the categories that they are seeing up over the last couple of weeks. Their executive vice president and CFO, Richard Galante, said on the call, and I quote this, "We're getting deliveries daily, but still not enough given the increased levels of demand on certain key items." Those key items that I just mentioned, they're starting to run out of those. They noted the need for quantity limits in some places on some products. This is really kind of a last-ditch effort to keep these products on the shelves, but they're trying their best not to do this. They would prefer people just to be able to come in, get however much they need of a certain item or however much they think they need of a certain item, and then leave. But Galante did credit their buyers, and we hear this a lot on the call. You know, our buyers are working hard, etc., but Galante said that they are literally working around the clock, 24/7 in some cases, to ensure supply of these products. But he also noted that it's because of their long-term strong relationships with suppliers, Procter & Gamble, let's say, among them, that's enabling them to get to some of these in-demand products before others. So credit goes to the buyers, credit also to those suppliers, and of course he gave credit to the store personnel who are dealing with those particular crowds. It's been said that the line's running all the way back to dairy in some of their stores. He also was in, it seemed like kind of a jovial mood on the call, but he said that he's noting a little bit less traffic on the highways in King County, Washington, which is their home base. But he said what traffic there is seems to all be coming to Costco because their stores are so busy there. Now, as far as other business impacts, something interesting is that they're finding challenges exporting products to their global stores because of a container shortage domestically. So they can't get those U.S. products out to those other Costco stores, or I shouldn't say they can't do so. They're just having difficulty in doing so. He said, while it's a challenge, it's really just a matter of taking more work here and that they haven't seen substantial impacts on this front. It's really just a matter of finagling those deals rather than business as usual. Christopher Horvers of JP Morgan, he was an analyst on the call. You know, sometimes we'll call out analysts for asking questions that are inane. Horvers had a really excellent question, so I do want to give him 100% credit for this. It was, I think, the best question on the call, where he said in a visit to a Costco this week, he noticed a number of these items in those particular coronavirus adjacent categories in carts, but he said he noted other big ticket items as well. And he asked, you know, are people spending less in these big ticket discretionary categories because of COVID-19? Well, Galante said in response that, you know, you would think so. You would think patio furniture and other things would be impacted as big ticket discretionary items. But in handwritten correspondences that he's receiving from their senior buyers, he said this doesn't appear to be the case. Now, Galante was upfront about saying that this appears to be anecdotal, and he expects for there to be some impacts when all is said and done. They get a chance to sort out the numbers. To what extent, maybe a little bit too early to tell. But Galante himself said he found it interesting that the increase in traffic has resulted in an increase in some of the other expected categories. They're finding customers that are coming in, buying hand sanitizer, buying bleach, or also buying in adjacent categories. They're not just coming in for those items. And traffic is up across the board. So that tells you that maybe there's some impulse buys there. Maybe they're picking up some ancillary items as well. Galante specifically mentioned lawn and garden as a category that is up dramatically for them, even over previous lawn and garden sales in late February and early March. And he said that that's even extending into the first few days of March as they were looking over the numbers as well. Now, of course, some of that could be weather-related impacts, but it bears to mention that the people coming in to buy these other products, they're not being turned away from some of these big ticket discretionary items. At least they don't think so. And you're seeing increases in maybe some unexpected categories. And finally, Galante said that something that caught both of us by surprise. Leighton talked all about that membership income and how they treat that as pure profit. But they were asked on the call about any benefit from the recent shopping surge on membership sales. And he said, look, it's been negligible. Nothing has moved the needle on that front. And he was asked that in the analyst Q&A, and he said, at least to this point, there's nothing that suggests we are seeing an increase in people buying those memberships. Now, of course, at the end of the quarter, we will get all of those numbers kind of fleshed out on their quarterly release. As Leighton said, the next 4 to 5 months going to be very interesting in retail. But I think that was interesting, for all the increase in sales that Costco has seen over last year because of COVID-19 and the potential threat that it poses, people aren't buying more Costco memberships, or at least buying more Costco memberships at any more of a rate than they were prior. Now, like I mentioned, we'll be joined after this break by Dani Cushion. She is the CMO of Cardlytics. All these first quarter shoppers that are after COVID-19 adjacent products, they might be really important to retailers, and she discusses why after this. The new customer, as they say, is always the most expensive customer, and that's why it's important for retailers to get things right as it pertains to customer acquisition. And joining us to discuss new data that suggests how crucial the first quarter in particular is for retailers to attract new customers is Dani Cushion. She's the CMO at Cardlytics. And Dani, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's always great being on with you.
It's always great to have you. I know we've talked about a lot of different data in the past, and particularly in the past about the importance of certain windows, back to school, for example, as far as customer retention and attraction is concerned. But what makes the first quarter of the year so critical from a customer attraction standpoint?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is what we've looked at in our data. And again, as a little primer, we see purchase data, nearly $3 trillion in purchase data. So we like to look at and work with our marketing clients to see when consumers are shopping, what are the things that drive repeat purchases. And, you've heard me say it before, but we do really love to geek out on our data because it can really make a big impact in a retailer's or a different merchant's business. So what we've been looking at this time of year, and actually started looking at it right after the holidays, is what it actually looks like when you get past the holiday season. And I think what we see is in Q1, so the January to March timeframe, we see a lot of people who bought during the holidays lapsing from specific retailers. And so this is, a little bit of an acquisition play, but this is really a conversation about loyalty and staying front of the consumers who have bought with you around the holidays but did not come back in Q1. And so when we actually look at the data, what we've seen is that roughly 77% of customers who were acquired for the first time during the holidays do not return to the same retailer in the first quarter of the year. So that's a huge number. Someone came in and bought in the holiday period with a retailer, but 77% did not come back and purchase with that retailer in Q1.
And so that's a massive number, of course, in terms of customers that are lapsing, but it's not just a matter of customers lapsing from one particular retailer, because they go on to shop at other retailers in the vertical. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Good lead in, actually, because I think the thing that's interesting is there's still shopping happening. It's not that shopping completely drops off in Q1. Obviously, there's a huge spike in Q4 around the holidays. But what we're actually seeing is that 40% of those, let's call them lapsed holiday customers, that's 77% who aren't coming back to a retailer in Q1. 40% of those are still shopping in the category, or with a retailer's competitor. So it actually just really means that it's so important to not stop marketing to the customers who are likely to buy with just because the holidays are done. And it's hard because I know there's a limited promotional budget and there's a limited time to do it, but it really does pay off. The retailers that we work with who, are working with us year round and running their advertising through our bank channels and reaching bank customers with those ads, the ones who are specifically targeting customers who bought during the holidays and trying to drive them back into a store in Q1 are doing very, very well right now. And I'll build a little bit on what that means. The folks who have actually been able to bring a customer, a holiday shopper, back into their store in Q1, they not only come in more throughout the year, but they spend more. And I'll break that down a little bit as to what we see. So the people who are actually coming back in, and if a marketer has been able to get a holiday shopper back in during Q1, they actually spend 4.6 times more between Q2 and Q4 with that same retailer compared to those who waited until Q2 or later. So more than 4x, they're spending more than 4x that rest of the year. If you can get them back in Q1, don't pull the pedal off the metal. Like, it's easy to say, okay, you can't be on all the time, but really you need to be. You can stage your campaigns. You can stage when you're thinking about, what your messaging is. But for the retailers that are actually just focusing on a holiday and saying, okay, Q1 will take care of itself, or it'll follow, it's going to be light. The ones with that mentality, it's going to be self-fulfilling. They will have a light Q1. The ones who are actually actively driving those holiday shoppers back in, they're keeping the habit going. They're keeping that purchase habit going, and they're spending 4.6 times more the rest of the year than those that were not coming back in Q1. And I'll do one more build if I may, because I think this is super interesting. The Q1 shoppers who do come back in, so they're not only spending 4.6 times more, they are a little over 2 times more likely to come in. So they're going to make a repeat purchase the rest of the year. So it's not just that they're spending more. You can flip those around if you want. They're going to come back into your store. They're going to buy something, and they're going to spend a lot more than those that you did not keep in Q1. So I'll pause there and make sure that makes sense, because I find that so fascinating that those who are actually losing holiday shoppers are really losing a ton of other sales and opportunity through the rest of the year.
And as you alluded to, the data suggests it's not only ticket size, but it's also that traffic, those repeat visits. What is it about that Q1 customer that makes them not only come back the rest of the year, but spend more in Q1 there as far as ticket size is concerned?
Yeah, at Cardlytics, there's something that we talk about here that we like to call the loyalty continuum. We've talked about this in the past, and that, back to school begets holiday, begets Q1, begets the rest of the year. It's just driving that next sale every single time. And I think the ones that are actually building that purchase habit, and, as you actually start to get into the groove, and loyals may not be fully loyal because they are shopping at your competitors as well, what you're trying to do is drive as much switching behavior as you can. Someone bought from you during the holidays, don't be that one and done. Stay on top of the customers. And again, if you can, ideally, you can target specifically the folks who bought from you during the holidays to re-engage them and keep them going. I really think it's just about building and responding to a specific customer behavior. And I think, as we've talked in other shows as well, being accessible and ready for a customer however they want to buy, whether it's online or in store. Ideally, both. The experience should both be great. Omnichannel customers do spend more than those who are buying in a single channel with a given retailer. But I really think just keeping that loyalty continuum going, the more that you can get that one next sale, it's so multiplicative in the results that you can drive through the year.
So we talk about the loyalty continuum. We talk about importance of marketing here in Q1. And we've talked in the past from a marketing perspective about how important it is for retailers to be consistent in their marketing message throughout the year. But what are some things on a high level that Cardlytics maybe suggests to clients to ensure that they're bringing people through their doors January through March?
Sure. I'll give you a couple of examples of how people work with us on this, and then some other things that we see those clients doing, outside of our channel that we think are working really well for them. I think from our standpoint, we're obviously reaching bank customers with customized ads based on their past purchase history. So if you have a retailer that we saw had a customer buying in the holiday season, a lot of our best partners right now, our best advertising clients, are actively going after the people who bought with them in the holidays to keep them going. So that's number one, what a lot of them are doing, because they're reaching, more than 100 million bank customers with an offer that is interesting, that gives them cash back, that gets them back into a store or online. So, that's the core of what we do. But what's interesting is the ones that are actually leaning into doing this with us are applying some other strategies as well that we see that's pretty interesting. There are a bunch that are trying free next day shipping or really leaning into their buy online, pick up on store strategies, which again helps to build that purchase behavior across channels. There are these clients who are spending with us, are spending in other paid media platforms as well, which is great. They are actually running other promotional campaigns and just making sure they keep the conversation going with the customer. So it's really just about making sure that there is a distinct effort to re-engage those that came in through the doors or through the site in the holiday season, and just making sure that you're continually speaking to those people and getting them back in.
Now, we talk a lot about best practices, but I want to kind of look at the other end of the spectrum because as your data shows, 77% of customers, that's a huge amount, end up lapsing or not returning to that retailer in the first quarter of the new year. What are some reasons, and I know the data is kind of agnostic to this, but what are some reasons in your experience that people aren't finding reasons to come back through the doors?
Yeah, you know what's interesting, and I will say you're right, this is absolutely anecdotal from the conversations that we have. I mean, we work with the largest retailers in the world, and so a lot of it is anecdotal. I think where we've seen, brands that we've learned from learning on their own is when they've been too seasonal in their approach. When you do want to dial it up and take advantage of when people are spending, but honestly, I think those that are not using data to inform their marketing and thinking about what does the profile of someone look like. Obviously, you want to have, promotions that you're running and everything, but those that are not using data accurately to think about what makes up, a good and likely buyer, like a holiday shopper, someone who's come in once makes up a good and likely buyer. The retailers who are actually taking advantage of that, figuring out how to, we have talked about this one too, but who are actually making great use of their first-party data and their CRM systems and figuring out how to then go back out and reach back out to the customers who are such low-hanging fruit. And then, of course, using, third-party data and platforms like ourselves to augment what they do. The ones who are doing very well are the ones who are really figuring out how to get their data shop in order and to be able to actively market against that. It's not just about what you know, it's being able to put it into use. The ones who are lagging, I think, in this area, it's not that you don't know you need to drive Q1 sales, of course. Of course you do. You need to drive Q1 sales. And there are people still marketing. But the ones that are doing better are the ones who are actually using data to figure out who are the high propensity to buy type customers based on their past purchase history. And that's really where we've seen the wheat separated from the chaff, is those who are using data well to go after those that have the highest likelihood to come back in and spend more.
And I want to kind of close by piggybacking off of that, and it's a little bit off the beaten path from what we've spent most of this interview talking about. But we talk about retailers oftentimes having data but not knowing how to use it, or retailers not using data effectively. From your perspective there at Cardlytics, what are some things that you're looking at, maybe new data that we've been able to generate over the past couple of years, or maybe future data that you're getting in? I don't want you to give away any company secrets, of course, but what are some data things regarding data that retailers should be excited about here over the next 6 months?
Yeah, well, I would say, again, I think the first and foremost thing that retailers need to have in order is a clear view, a centralized view of their customers, no matter how they're buying. And I think and I will get to the coming forward, I think the clear view of how your customers are buying with you is super important. And if your in-store is not connected to your online with a single view of the customer, get there. You got to get there, because consumers don't care how they shop at this point. They want to shop how they want to shop when they want to. And so if you don't have that centralized first, you're not going to be able to scale on it. I think from our perspective, the stuff that's coming down the pike for us is a lot of the same of what we've always done, which is to help fill in the visibility gaps as to where else a brand's customers shop. And so for us, it's a bit more of the same, where we can actually help augment. A retailer might know everything about where and when their customer shops with them, but we see everything else. We see where they're shopping with competitors. We see how much they're spending. We see where other categories they might be spending in, which might flag a high propensity to buy a certain type of item. I think from our perspective, we continue to grow the amount of what we see. We launched Chase last year. We're in the midst of launching with Wells Fargo as a bank partner now. We're in the U.S. and the U.K. And so the more banks that we partner with to provide these great loyalty solutions, the more purchase data we see. Even though wholly anonymized, it actually does help merchants be able to fill in the gaps as to what they know. It all starts with what you know from your own data, but we're excited with where we're going and working with our partners to keep educating and growing and understanding the whole wallet picture, because there's a lot of headroom and a lot of opportunity to drive sales just by acting on really interesting insights that you might not have seen on your own.
Yeah, basically to sum that up, it's now possible for retailers to not only connect the e-commerce from the in-store consumer but connect the rest of the consumer picture, as you mentioned, their entire wallet as well. One final thing we always close on here, we always ask you about what the new report is coming out from Cardlytics. What's the next report that you'll be working on there?
We're hot working on back to school right now. And it's funny, it might seem early for that, but from a marketer's planning perspective, it's now. I think interestingly, we also have some little pieces of content that we've been talking to clients out about recently, and I'm not sure if we're going to do anything deep on it, but we probably will hit it in a blog or put some numbers out. The landscape right now with the political season really compresses the TV landscape as well. So there's a whole bunch of new ads coming in and absolutely increasing the cost for TV buys for a lot of brands, and it's making it super hard to get their message out. And so a lot of what we're actually looking at is what does that do for media buying, and how do we work with marketers to make sure that they're still getting the reach and the scale that they need to drive sales in a particularly challenging macro political environment, media buying environment, because of the fact that it is a political year. So that, we'll be putting some stuff out on that in the next month or so probably. But truly, back to school is what is top of mind for a lot of marketers that we're doing planning with right now, which, as we've talked about in the past, back to school sets you up for holiday, which sets you up for Q1, which sets you up for back to school. So it is all about that continuum. And, we'll continue to keep you and your listeners in the loop as we put out new research, because it's always sort of interesting to dig into the data and see what it tells us.
Well, it's fantastic to have you on talking about that. That's a great point as far as TV ads, advertising across the board. Those rates are going to go up. How do retailers respond? So good stuff. We'll look forward to that. Dani, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
Well, we thank Dani once again for joining us here on the podcast. It's always a delight to have her on, especially given the sheer amount of data that Cardlytics has access to, and we'll look forward to some of their back-to-school numbers as well. But I think it's very interesting, especially the television advertising numbers that she was discussing with us regarding this being a political season. You're seeing prices for those television ads or other forms of advertising increase. How is that going to affect the bottom line of retailers over the next few quarters? Well, we're moving on, and each quarter we try to highlight one of the dollar store retailers, or so-called dollar store retailers. Really, at this point, they're just general merchandise retailers. This quarter, it's Dollar Tree's turn. Last quarter, we talked about Dollar General. When we talk about Dollar Tree, of course, Family Dollar wrapped into that. And Leighton, we did a deep dive on this earnings call, an update on some of their initiatives. Because this is the year-end earnings call for them, we felt like it was very important to cover this in depth.
Dollar Tree, of course, being one of our favorite retailers, but having bought Family Dollar, as Trent alluded to, just about a half decade ago, really brings to light a lot of questions about the operation of the company. So we're excited to bring you this particular earnings call. Dollar Tree's share price has had a rough go of it lately, with shares above $90 just a few weeks ago that are down to now around the $80 mark, despite an earnings beat on Wednesday. And you see analysts predicted earnings per share of $1.76, and Dollar Tree came in with adjusted earnings per share of $1.79, so a 3-cent beat, just like in our former story. Of late, there are a number of developments onlookers have been keeping an eye on as far as Dollar Tree is concerned. First and foremost is the continued adjustment after the Family Dollar deal that we are now nearing the 5-year mark since inception, like I talked about. And they've been busy renovating and updating Family Dollar stores to provide more perishable goods and slightly different or refreshed layouts within the store. You see some better lighting, some cleaner layouts, but these are known as their H2 format. We'll talk about that a little bit later, or at least Trent will. Additionally, each year since the close of the merger, Dollar Tree has gone about targeting certain Family Dollar locations to turn them into Dollar Tree stores. And we certainly see that in the real estate landscape. They're signing new leases with stores that have been refreshed, remodeled, and rebranded to the Dollar Tree format. They've seen a benefit from both of these initiatives in the face of analysts and activist investor pressure to divest the Family Dollar division. In fact, it was about a year ago, Trent, we talked about on the podcast, some investors backed off this notion, admitting that Dollar Tree was making strides in the Family Dollar division and making it as profitable as it could be. Another initiative that has seen a lot of analyst attention at Dollar Tree is the debut of items for above the $1 price point at Dollar Tree stores. So for anyone familiar with the Dollar Tree brand out there, typically Dollar Tree stores, they will always have items $1 or less. They have candy sometimes for 69 cents, but it's right around that $1 price point. And we were wondering about the different reactions to them increasing that threshold at some of their locations. We've been somewhat split with analysts about it. In fact, many of whom we suspect have not spent a lot of time around Dollar Tree stores and their core customers. Still, the launch at select locations of products over $1 called Dollar Tree Plus has gone well to this point. So we've been looking forward to this call to get updates on a number of things. Of course, these things were somewhat overshadowed by questions about coronavirus and, of course, their supply chain exposure to China. But first, we dig into the numbers. Let's first address the raw numbers from their fourth quarter prior to digging in to major initiatives, which I know, Trent, you have a lot of light to shed on activities within the company. And well, despite the earnings beat, same-store sales did leave a little bit to be desired. Dollar Tree same-store sales, so taking out the Family Dollar in this equation, which have traditionally been solid to robust, increased just 1.4% over the prior year's fourth quarter. It does bear mentioning that because of their mostly set price points in stores, like I had previously mentioned, they don't see inflationary impacts driving prices upward, so the 1.4% increase is more impactful than you would say see at Kroger. So for Family Dollar, it pretty much went in the opposite direction, which is somewhat worrisome, with comps falling 0.8%. So again, negative 0.8% same-store sales. And this is another setback as they continue to attempt to chase their tail with renovations and other initiatives to try to improve the chain's standing in the light of heavy competition from, of course, the dominant Dollar General, who we regard as one of the top general merchandise retailers now in the U.S. Because of the softness at Family Dollar, by the way, enterprise comps actually saw just a 0.4% increase. So while Dollar Tree did fairly well, Family Dollar is certainly bringing them down for the company as a whole. The good news is that both traffic and ticket were up at Dollar Tree, weighted slightly towards ticket increases, but still a positive sign overall. And for perspective, they were coming off a third quarter where enterprise comps were up 2.5%. So we're talking about company-wide comps up 2.5% over the prior year, including a 2.3% increase at Family Dollar. So these results were not what we were looking for at all for this particular quarter. But in other financial areas, Trent, the company saw slight improvement year over year. Consolidated net sales saw an increase of 1.8%. Those are the sales for the company overall, driven mostly by the introduction of new stores into their pipeline. Both Family Dollar and Dollar Tree, by the way, opened new stores. Gross profit did increase 2.5%, which is a good sign against some inflationary pressures. And especially in certain categories, we see a lot of inflation affecting dollar stores. However, gross margin was down slightly as a percentage of net sales by around 50 basis points. Additionally, selling, general, and administrative expenses, those were up 60 basis points, driven by higher payroll, which we have seen in multiple retail areas. However, we have been in awe of their adjusted operating income margin, which has usually hovered around low double digits to high single digits. They came in right around that mark again with operating income margin of around 9.2%, so fairly robust in that particular category. Compared with last year's fourth quarter, though, this is down. They were around 10.2% last year. And Trent, here is where I hand it off to you, and we're going to talk about some initiatives here, a lot to dig into. And we talked about those store openings. They continued the momentum for store openings in the fourth quarter on a net basis. It's really a matter of keeping up with the Joneses in this space, really with Dollar General just exploding with new locations across the U.S.
Dollar Tree did its level best to keep up in the fourth quarter. They did open 112 new stores across their enterprise. They expanded or relocated 17 stores. This all came, though, while closures continued to mark the Family Dollar segment. Overall, the company closed 95 stores enterprise-wide during the quarter, most of those Family Dollars. So if you net that out, we're looking at a net of 17 store openings. That pales compared to Dollar General's triple-digit net opening numbers that they are getting each quarter, looking at 4 digits of new stores each year. We talked in the intro of this Dollar Tree story about their efforts surrounding Family Dollar to either renovate or rebrand the stores. That continued in earnest in the fourth quarter. They updated 5 Family Dollar stores to the H2 format. Slow but sure, but still, we would like to see the numbers higher here, and they've at least promised that the numbers will go higher on that front during the next year. We'll talk about that in a second, especially since H2 stores in their first year are comping at greater than 10% on average. Just seems like an automatic path for the Family Dollar division to boost sales. And it's not just a matter of building those comps. They're building repeat customers, which is something they're finding through that H2 model as well. And as Dani Cushion just discussed, those repeat customers, especially in Q1, are the most valuable. So you would think there might be maybe a little bit more of an emphasis on this, and it does appear as though the company will emphasize that more going forward. As an aside, they've noted that those comp increases, that double digits in terms of comp increases when they update a store to the H2 format, are relatively similar in both rural and urban locations. So it's not just one type of location for them. Rural locations are really big for Family Dollar and Dollar General. A lot of them have set up in towns of less than 10,000 people, and especially these towns that don't have a Walmart, it is important to evaluate how those H2 store formats are working there. So it's great news for them that it's working in both of their theaters, so to speak, in both rural and urban locations. Additionally, just talking about this last quarter, they rebranded 10 Family Dollar stores to Dollar Tree locations with successful launches, in each case during the course of the quarter. That is something that they have been doing a lot of over the last 3 years. Now, while coronavirus was a call topic, they underscored the diversity of countries for their sourcing, which they expect to expand this year. So it's not just a matter of sourcing all their products from one overseas location. CEO Gary Philbin actually said that they embarked on a post-holiday buying trip in January, and they noted the representation of 8 additional countries in their open buying day event. So they're getting more countries represented, they're getting more factories represented, and this trip, because of that, the buyers felt was more productive than in years past. It allowed them to drive some of those buying prices down with so much competition on the supply front. Now, the big thing in terms of prepared remarks is that to this point, they've seen business as usual as far as their imports are concerned. They noted that all of their Easter merchandise, as well as lawn and garden, already in their supply chain system. Additionally, for any potential delays experienced as a result of coronavirus, they've been able to find those alternate sources of product. There are more manufacturers now than there used to be, so they're able to get out there, find different ways to bring in product to minimize any impacts on those imports. Meanwhile, we talked last week about how impressive it was that Home Depot showed strength in the U.S. regardless of region. That was not the case for Dollar Tree as an organization. In fact, it was kind of spotty. They saw strong performances across the enterprise in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. Elsewhere, though, there was a little bit of softness. Now, as far as categories were concerned, they saw positive comps in consumables, which, again, they've been investing heavily in, and that's a big part of their H2 model for Family Dollar, as well as a few things they've got going on at Dollar Tree that we'll mention later. They did mention that discretionary was also up. Discretionary for them, somewhat of an amorphous category, but generally speaking, we're not talking about necessarily key items. That was mostly on the Dollar Tree front. Discretionary suffered a little bit in Family Dollar, and they were kind of disappointed about that. Now, they did mention that for both Thanksgiving and Christmas as well, they were able to move merchandise at a beneficial cadence for them, which minimized the seasonal markdowns and closeouts. This had a couple of effects. One, of course, it helped their margins out, but two, it helped that top line out because they weren't discounting things to 25 or 50%, especially in those Family Dollar stores, especially when you're talking about consumables, things like candy that are branded Thanksgiving or Christmas. Other positive areas for the company sales-wise included arts and crafts, which is another area of focus for Dollar Tree, pet supplies, which we're seeing be the case across the country, and snacks and beverage. They credit success in these categories in large part to a greater focus on different zones for the merchandise. So when you go into, and this is usually specific to Dollar Tree, but they've been doing a little bit of this in Family Dollar as well, these zones are branded differently than just a typical store area devoted to certain merchandise. It's not like going down an aisle and saying, oh, here's all the craft stuff. We're talking about in-store signage. We're talking about these little pods or locations within the store that are focused more on driving attention and impulse buys as customers flow through the store. A big example for Dollar Tree is their snack zone, which they added to over 1,000 stores in fiscal 2019. They felt as though this rollout, which is now in over 2,100 stores total across the chain, has managed to fuel impulse buys in this segment. They're also very excited about Dollar Tree's Crafter Square initiative. Again, not just a matter of putting crafts in a place within the store on a shelf somewhere. They are looking at branding this separately. They've given it credit already for bumping the sales up in their arts and crafts category. They've tried this out in over 650 total stores for now, but there is a more extensive rollout plan for 2020. They are looking to keep the Crafter Square price point anchored, though, at $1 rather than crossing over with their special Dollar Tree Plus selection. And Leighton, we've been talking about this, what we know now as Dollar Tree Plus, for a couple of years, and we got a lot of crucial updates on how they are managing to adjust their system.
Speaking of Dollar Tree Plus, they are tinkering with the current trials they've run to move into Dollar Tree Plus 2.0. The 2.0 version will shift away from consumable items, which did not test nearly as well as in multiple categories. As we've said in the past, customers have been drawn to the $1 price point for consumables for so long, and their selection has been good in this particular area that customers would see an increase in price point as an increase in prices for particular goods rather than Dollar Tree attempting to add new products altogether. However, the rollout has been not necessarily a bust for certain categories, among them electronics, HBA, and of course seasonal. One interesting thing of note is that they said they would include greater selection of toys in the 2.0 version as well. The reason this is interesting is, as we've talked about in February, it is clear that toys are taking a bit of a hit on the general merchandise front in aggregate, as sales from Toys R Us have yet to be completely replaced. And we've seen that with a number of retailers taking advantage, but not necessarily full advantage. You can't really tell if toy sales are maybe down in the industry overall, but nonetheless, the other feature at Dollar Tree 2.0 is they're going to see, Dollar Tree Plus 2.0 is that they're going to be changing the location of these pods within the store, allowing for greater awareness of the program and this adjusted price point. This will be more easily done in their large square footage locations. They have some as big as, by the way, 20,000 square feet versus the locations that are much smaller, think around 6,000 to 7,000 square feet in size, where selection is really, really cramped. Another issue we speculated they might run into with adding items above the $1 price point is customer confusion about which items are at which price point. This is something that, according to remarks made on the call, they have actually run into. So this is a real issue, and they are now working to enhance in-store signage, but also find additional ways to delineate the products from the rest of the store. Think about the customers who are unaware, so basically the customers who don't listen to this podcast, unaware of this new promotion, of this new Dollar Tree Plus format within these pilot stores. If you're buying this particular merchandise that's maybe been spread across the store throughout the weekend and it's at a $2 price point, you're looking at your receipt wondering if they did something wrong there at the register. So a lot of things they have to clear up so the customers know ahead of time what they're buying and for how much it is. Finally, regarding the Family Dollar side of the company, they were understandably a bit disappointed with comps that I had noted earlier, which were in the negative territory, noting that negative comps were spread around the country fairly evenly. So you see here, there were a few important things to note. First, they said that January comps were more significantly negative than in December and November as a result of a later rollout of SNAP benefits in January 2020 versus January of 2019. And this comes back to the very base of a company like Family Dollar, where they can generate a significant amount of their sales through a program like this. We can't state this enough. This is one of the reasons why Dollar General has been successful, and Family Dollar can be successful without having an e-commerce presence. It's easy to be distracted by e-commerce sales, but many analysts completely forget about the part of the U.S. population that relies on SNAP benefits and uses them for these types of stores in this store format. Despite this, though, Family Dollar's consumables comped positive for the 13th consecutive quarter. This is a big positive for them. This came while discretionary was down lower than company expectations, which was troubling given it was their holiday shopping season quarter. But we look ahead and we see that they were clear in their response to their forecast for the upcoming fiscal year, and they did not include any potential impacts from COVID-19, simply because it was far too early to tell the exact extent to which their business will be affected. This is a number of retailers out there, by the way. They're in the same exact boat. They are looking at low single-digit increases in comp sales. They didn't get more specific than that, unfortunately. They also expect growth in selling square footage, meaning they predict new net stores and expansion in some particular markets. This will parlay itself, they feel, into earnings per share being slightly higher by around 3 to 5% than this year.
And while they weren't specific on the number of net new stores, because again, that's always something we're watching with that competition from Dollar General breathing down their neck, they preferred to reference square footage instead. They were very specific, however, on the number of Family Dollar H2 renovations. I mentioned earlier, they're looking to ramp those up this year. 1,250 in total is what they are looking at this year, and that could make a significant positive impact if we're talking about comps. Those locations comping over 10% better than what they were the year prior. This is a massive increase over what we've seen to this point as far as rate of renovation. To this point, in fact, they've renovated only 1,100 mature stores, so they're going to more than double the number of H2 locations throughout the country. We would expect this to have certainly a positive same-store sales impact, but it's important to keep this in mind as you look at their numbers during the course of the next year, knowing that these renovations are going to take place. They certainly could produce a positive impact on same-store sales, but if we get same-store sales numbers and those comps numbers in the neighborhood of 1 to 2%, we know those stores that aren't being renovated, they're in awful trouble and probably need to be renovated sometime soon. Well, we're going to finish up with a quick story about Kroger, and they released earnings this week. We just did want to touch on a few things there. Rather than their earnings call carrying a headline about, the earnings, the headline read, Kroger delivers on key 2019 commitments. Now, one thing they did deliver on, Leighton, was an earnings beat, albeit slight. They came in with 57 cents in adjusted earnings per share against an analyst expectation of 56 cents.
Yeah, let's look at some more of their numbers. Kroger did post a good number on comp sales, and excluding fuel impacts, of course, comp sales were up 2%. This was bolstered by digital sales growth of around 22%, Trent. So the 2% outpaces food inflation slightly, just ever so slightly, but is also on top of decent comp increases from last year's fourth quarter of around 1.9%. A major sub-headline was their increase in fourth quarter operating profit from last year, with adjusted numbers up 20.7% or to $758 million. That's a lot of money, and part of this is their endeavor to really find attractive alternative profit streams, something they've been talking about for the last year or so on these earnings calls. They were willing to call this a partial success for the year two, with those alternative profit streams leading to over $100 million in additional operating profit for the year. The reason we're talking about adjusted numbers is because Kroger's fourth quarter saw an impairment charge come to roost for the planned closure of around 35 stores across the country. It's going to cost them around $52 million in order to execute on that. Additionally, we wondered aloud in January what the impact would be to Kroger for the Lucky's Market bankruptcy. That number, at least for now, is $174 million. So they are potentially having to pay some maybe early lease termination fees with that particular Lucky's bankruptcy. But we see here they were specific in noting that there is no impact on adjusted free cash flow guidance as a result of that particular charge. They benefited from a reduced tax rate in the quarter as well, which is not something we've seen retailers talk about much. In fact, the likes of Costco saw their effective tax rate increase slightly recently. For Costco, it's going to be a matter of trying to mitigate the different impacts from the profitability, trying to expense as many items as you can as you try to build out more stores globally. But for Kroger, this tax rate fell 260 basis points, which is actually fairly substantial for the banner. This being their fourth quarter, they also released, of course, projected guidance for fiscal 2020. This guidance does not include any potential coronavirus impact. It calls for full-year identical sales to increase by a substantial figure, around 2.25% or greater. They anticipate adjusted earnings per share to increase from $2.19 per share this year to around $2.30 to $2.40, or within that range. Along with this increase, they see operating profit also increasing slightly from an adjusted $3 billion this year to around $3 to $3.1 billion total in 2020. The jump in adjusted earnings per share outpacing the jump in operational profit has to largely do with planned share repurchases. So for that, they set a wide target, anywhere from $500 million, Trent, to $1 billion in outlay in 2020.
Now, we wanted to talk a little bit about the details they gave on the call, specifically as far as COVID-19 is concerned. And one of the interesting things is they started off the call just by saying, hey, it's too early to tell exactly the impact that it'll have on our business. Now, it's interesting because, Leighton, you and I have talked with store managers of these Kroger locations, maybe under different brands, and they all seem to think that really the performance is higher. So the question was asked by Ken Goldman on the call. He's an analyst, and he said, hey, Campbell's Soup yesterday talked about how they're experiencing increased orders from grocers. How is it impacting you guys? And once again, Rodney McMullen said it's way too early to say for sure, and then went on about, trying to protect their associates, trying to protect their customers, and so forth. And I think it's very interesting because one of two things is happening here. Either the first thing, which is that maybe they legitimately don't know about the positive sales numbers that Costco was very transparent about on their call coming in, because that's just not how their data is oriented. Or I think the second and more likely case is they're unwilling to say that it's going to impact them in a positive nature because they don't want to let analysts, shareholders, the media, etc. down if they don't see that much of a positive impact on their next earnings call. I would, again, tend towards the latter because Kroger is a very data-centric company. I think that McMullen and Gary Millerchip certainly know how it's going to impact them, or how it's impacted them to this point so far. Gary Millerchip did mention on the call that some of those categories that Costco mentioned, hand sanitizer, hand soap, paper, box dinners, that type of thing, are seeing a bit of an increase, but he also mentioned that there's nothing in the last few days that it's any different than what they would have expected, which, again, we know from talking to Kroger store managers, talking to Kroger employees, that's not the case. They're seeing demand certainly ratchet up in certain areas and in stores overall. And certainly the store that I went to just yesterday was absolutely packed with people trying to stock up on those items. One of the other interesting things moving away from COVID-19 on the show that they mentioned is regarding their pharmacy. Gary Millerchip said on the call when asked about it that they do expect pricing pressures to continue for pharmacy, something that we've mentioned for CVS, Walgreens, and the like, with the number of generics coming onto the market, increased pricing pressures there, so lowered margins. But one of the interesting things that they're kind of looking towards over the next year or potentially two is a way to fold in their pharmacy services, whether that's, getting shots at a Kroger pharmacy, getting your actual scripts filled at a Kroger pharmacy. How do they tie in food with this idea? Because again, Kroger's going with this new ad campaign, the Fresh for All ad campaign. They're really trying to push the fresh foods, their organic foods. And both he and McMullen mentioned on the call is that Kroger wants to take steps towards focusing on people living healthier. And they want people to think about a prescription also being a prescription to eat healthier or eat different foods. So they're really looking at this particular model as far as how can we change it to where when customers get a prescription filled, how can we incentivize the purchase of some of these fresh organic foods, most of them having a bit of a higher price point than, say, some of those prepackaged foods that are seen as being unhealthy on the whole. So I think that's very interesting, and I'm anxious certainly to see how they're going to tie that in with their current ad campaign. I think for me, outside of any of the coronavirus and that type of thing that was discussed on the call, I think that was the most intriguing thing to come out of the call. I really want to see how they tie that pharmacy together with the rest of the store, because you look at other retailers, they really haven't been able to do that. You look at retailers that have produce sections that also have pharmacies, the likes of Albertsons, Safeway comes to mind, Walmart comes to mind. They haven't really been able to do this yet, so it'll be interesting to see if Kroger can really kind of take the lead in that category.
As always, we may have a position in or against companies we discuss on the podcast. Do not invest in stocks solely on the input of the podcast hosts.
Well, we've reached the final segment of the Retail Focus podcast, a segment we call Looking Ahead, where each Leighton and I take a look at one story that we're keeping an eye on over the next week, month, or year, and we start with Leighton.
For my looking ahead, I'm going to stay with the theme of earnings this week. A retailer that we've talked about a lot here on the podcast, and a retailer that we're a fan of because of their bullish growth in the most recent years, Burlington Stores. They saw their stock pop just a little bit this week after their earnings call. Their adjusted earnings per share were up, their revenue was up, and this is my looking ahead because it's not just a steady company that continues to execute on growth plans. This is very interesting because this is a company that has grown amazingly fast in terms of new stores over the last couple of years with the closures of Toys R Us and Sears throughout the country. So I've personally visited several locations, several Burlington locations that have now taken the spots of those retailers. So we're talking about Toys R Us stores that are quite large, and then also coming into Sears locations where the landlord, the current owner of these shopping centers, has split up the location space such that Burlington can go in with a Ross or another retailer, and they don't have to take up all the entirety of that square footage. But you're seeing a lot of success because as soon as these new Burlington stores open, you see that traffic increase, and that is certainly representative in terms of their sales as well, where Burlington Stores brought in $2.2 billion in sales for the most recent quarter, and adjusted earnings per share that actually beat analysts' expectations. And you see it was a slight beat on expectations, but still the expectations are relatively high. And for this particular podcast, we talk about expectations all the time, so it's kind of relative, their performance, to what everybody, or even sometimes us, are expecting. And so we see that their comp sales also being up 3.8% speaks to the fact that they're opening these new stores, yes, a little bit aggressively, but it's not too aggressive. They're doing it in a sustainable fashion because they're bringing in constant traffic, and those new stores are pretty quickly contributing to the bottom line. And I think it's very interesting for a company that's been around for so long that this off-price sector is really now their identity. And it's interesting too, because if you remember back 10, 15, 20 years ago, Burlington Stores were taking in these areas where maybe their square footage was nearing 100,000 square feet. But now, like I said, they're okay with these larger Toys R Us stores that are substantially less than that. And with that goes very good operational management. They said during this latest call that inventory was down 15%. So it's interesting because revenue and same-store sales was up, but meanwhile, the supply chain and their inventory at each particular location is really optimal. It's optimal in terms of their financial performance, for cash flow, for free cash flow, but then they also know what their customers are wanting, so their inventory turn rate for the items that they do have in store is going to be executed on and doing very, very well for them in the quarters to come. I think it's very interesting because you have management now, a team of managers, the executive team, that they know what they're doing, they know what their core customer is, and they're still confident in opening these new locations. So I'm curious to see how the rest of the year goes, the rest of the calendar year goes for Burlington, and if they can continue to execute on that growth strategy.
My looking ahead has to do this week with something that years from now we'll probably look back at and shake our heads. As it was announced this week that Trunk Club will be going by the wayside, or at least the brand will be, as Nordstrom, who now owns Trunk Club, will fold their resources into their own brands. Now, Nordstrom acquired Trunk Club back in 2014, and we haven't talked about Nordstrom in a couple of years on the podcast, but when we did, we were highly critical of the move. I remember doing a podcast back in 2016 where we were saying there is no way out for Trunk Club, and here, 4 years later, it's finally being folded into the rest of Nordstrom. What Nordstrom is going to do is incorporate those services into a styling offer. Basically, if you're familiar with Stitch Fix, you're familiar with the Trunk Club overall concept. Just think Stitch Fix at a higher price point there. People would come in, they would have what they called clubs. People would get measured, people would meet with a stylist. There were 6 of these clubs throughout the country. All of these are going away as Nordstrom kind of folds their services into their mainstream operations. And very interesting because this type of thing is happening across retail. It's not just in clothing. It's not just in apparel retail. We talk about it certainly happening with the meal kits, meal prep kits as well. Brands like Albertsons and Safeway saying, hey, we're just going to brand something ourselves. That's what's going on here. My looking ahead is, will Nordstrom really kind of integrate this into their company, or is this a savvy PR move to just kind of say, hey, we're just killing off the concept overall because we don't see a way that it can be profitable? Now, if they did fold it into their individual stores, that would certainly give them a little bit of opportunity to spread the service out or spread the service under their brand, because their brand, let's face it, is a lot stronger than what Trunk Club's was. They could certainly choose to do that. I think it's probably going to be something where you're going to see this kind of just quietly disappear in Nordstrom's offering over the next few years. I'm not sure that the model will work for Nordstrom. I think it could work for other retailers. Certainly, I think you're still limited. If you go to Stitch Fix and you wear a weird size like I do, they just don't have clothing for you, period. So it's still limited to people that have what I would call normal sizes or ordinary sizes. So that is something to keep in mind as far as the concept is concerned. But at least we know now that Nordstrom, over the next couple of years after they finish writing off all of these associated costs, won't be taking a financial hit due to Trunk Club like they have been over the last 4 years. That'll do it for us here on the Retail Focus podcast. Big thanks once again to Dani Cushion of Cardlytics for joining us on today's show. And we will be back 7 days from now. Next week, we'll have an interview guest who will be talking about writing descriptions for e-commerce products. We talked about the photography for those products. We're going to talk about writing descriptions for those products next week.
This has been the Retail Focus Podcast. For more, visit our website at retailfocuspodcast.com and subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. Follow us on Twitter at Retail Podcast.